In the winter of 1891, three French-Canadian fur trappers pushed their canoes into the frozen wilderness of northern Ontario, following trap lines that stretched deeper into the forest than any white man had ventured in years. They were experienced woodsmen, men who'd survived countless winters in country that killed the unprepared without mercy. But what they encountered in those dark woods would leave two of them dead and the third man broken, telling a story so disturbing that even hardened frontier veterans who heard it felt their blood run cold. He spoke of something that stalked them through the snow, something that wasn't bear or wolf or any natural predator, something that had once been human, but had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, becoming a creature of such terrible hunger that it could never be satisfied, no matter how much it consumed. The story begins not in 1891, but decades earlier, in the brutal winter of 1857, when the seeds of what would become the trapper's nightmare were first planted. That year, an Ojibwe hunting party disappeared in the same region of forest where the trappers would later run their lines. 17 men, women, and children vanished during a particularly harsh February when temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground, and exposed skin developed frostbite in minutes. Search parties found their camp abandoned. Fires cold, no signs of struggle. The tracks leading away from the camp showed the group walking in single file deeper into the forest, away from their village, away from safety, walking toward nothing but endless trees and certain death. But here's what made the searchers' skin crawl. The tracks were made by people walking barefoot in snow 3 feet deep. In weather cold enough to kill in minutes, these people had removed their winter clothing and walked into the wilderness to die. The Ojibwe elders knew immediately what had happened, even though the younger men wanted to believe there had to be another explanation. They spoke of the Wendigo, a name that translates roughly to the evil that devours or the spirit of lonely places. According to their traditions, the Wendigo wasn't simply a monster to frighten children. It was a very real spiritual affliction that struck during the darkest parts of winter when food ran scarce and desperation set in. A person who resorted to consuming human flesh to survive wouldn't just carry guilt. They would become infected by a malevolent spiritual force that transformed them into something no longer human. The transformation wasn't instant. It was gradual, insidious. First came the dreams, then the terrible hunger that no amount of normal food could satisfy. Then the physical changes as the curse took hold. The afflicted would grow taller, thinner. Their eyes would take on a hollow, hungry quality. Their skin would become pale and tight against their bones. Ice would form in their hearts, and they would develop an insatiable craving for the only food that seemed to ease their suffering: human flesh. But here's the detail that even experienced anthropologists find disturbing. The Wendigo condition seems to have been recognized across multiple Algonquian-speaking peoples from the Great Lakes all the way to the Atlantic coast, cultures separated by thousands of miles with limited contact. The Cree knew it. The Ojibwe knew it. The Innu of Labrador knew it. The descriptions remain remarkably consistent across all these groups. Something about the combination of extreme winter conditions, isolation, starvation, and the psychological breaking point where cannibalism becomes conceivable created conditions where this affliction could take hold. Modern psychiatrists have attempted to explain it as a culture-bound syndrome, a form of psychosis unique to these northern peoples living under extreme environmental stress. They've even given it a clinical name: Wendigo psychosis. But that explanation doesn't account for the physical evidence that 19th century witnesses documented. The tracks that showed impossible speeds through deep snow. The partially consumed bodies found frozen in positions suggesting they'd been eaten while still alive. The accounts from multiple independent sources describing the same physical characteristics of the afflicted. The French-Canadian trappers who pushed into the forest in 1891 were aware of these stories but dismissed them as Indian superstition. Their names were Thomas Mercier, Antoine Bouchard, and Claude Fontaine, all from the fur trading post at Moose Factory on James Bay. They'd been hired by the Hudson's Bay Company to survey potential new trap lines in territory that had been left largely untouched for over 30 years, ever since the disappearance of that Ojibwe hunting party. The company was expanding operations and needed men willing to venture into regions other trappers avoided. The pay was excellent, triple the normal rate, which should have been their first warning that something was wrong. But times were hard, furs were valuable, and the three men were confident in their abilities to handle whatever the wilderness threw at them. They departed Moose Factory on January 3rd, 1891, paddling and portaging their canoes southward into the interior. The plan was to spend 3 weeks surveying the territory, marking potential trap sites, and returning with maps and recommendations. They carried supplies for a month just to be safe. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, tea, tobacco, ammunition for their rifles, standard provisions for winter trapping. Their journals, which would later be found and partially recovered, show that the first week passed without incident. They made good time through familiar territory, following frozen rivers and well-known portage routes. The weather held clear and cold, but manageable. Game was scarce, but they managed to shoot a few rabbits and one small deer. Everything seemed routine. The tone of the journal entries changed on January 10th. Thomas Mercier, who kept the most detailed records, noted that they'd crossed into the territory that the Ojibwe hunters from Moose Factory had warned them to avoid. He wrote that Antoine had laughed at the warnings, calling them ghost stories, but that Claude had grown quiet and seemed uncomfortable. That night, they made camp in a small clearing beside a frozen stream. The fire burned hot, their shelter was solid, and they had full bellies from the deer meat. But something felt wrong. Mercier wrote that the forest around them seemed too quiet. No wind rustled the branches. No owls called in the darkness. No wolves howled in the distance. Just oppressive, complete silence that pressed in from all sides. He noted that their dog, a large mixed breed named Brutus, they'd brought along to help haul gear, refused to sleep. The animal sat at the edge of their firelight, staring out into the darkness, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling continuously in its chest. Around 2 a.m, Brutus suddenly charged into the forest, barking frantically. The three men grabbed their rifles and followed, their lanterns casting wild shadows through the trees. They found the dog about 50 yards from camp, standing over tracks in the snow. Human tracks, but wrong, in ways that made them all fall silent. The prints were elongated, easily 14 or 15 inches long, made by bare feet, despite the temperature being well below zero. The toes were splayed in an unnatural way, almost claw-like, and the stride length between prints measured over 6 feet, suggesting whatever made them had either been running at full speed or was tall enough that such a stride came naturally. The tracks approached their camp from the north, circled the perimeter multiple times, then headed south again into deeper forest. Whatever made them had stood outside their shelter, watching them sleep, close enough that careful examination showed where it had leaned against trees to peer through gaps in their walls. Antoine wanted to follow the tracks immediately, convinced they'd been spied on by a hostile Indian and determined to confront the intruder. But Claude refused, his normally ruddy face pale in the lantern light. He pointed out that no sane person walked barefoot through winter snow, which meant whoever or whatever made those tracks was either already dead and didn't know it, or was something worse than an enemy. Mercier agreed they should wait for daylight, and the three men returned to camp. But none of them slept. They kept the fire built high and their rifles loaded, taking turns on watch. Brutus refused to settle down, pacing constantly and growling at shadows. As dawn finally broke gray and cold, they discovered something that made their decision for them. During the night, while they'd been investigating the tracks to the north, something had entered their camp from the south. Their food cache had been torn open. All their meat was gone, not just the venison, but also the salt pork they'd stored in a supposedly bear-proof container. The thief had been strong enough to bend thick metal clasps and tear through heavy canvas. But here's what terrified them. Mixed in with the animal and human tracks around the plundered cache were spots of frozen blood. Something had been bleeding as it stole their food, and the blood was black as pitch, thick and viscous even in the frigid air. Nothing like normal human or animal blood. They broke camp immediately, planning to return to Moose Factory and report what they'd found. But Antoine, the most stubborn of the three, argued they couldn't return empty-handed after just 1 week. He convinced the others that whatever had raided their camp was probably just a rogue trapper or a deranged hermit who could be avoided easily enough. They had ammunition for hunting and could replace their stolen supplies with fresh game. They were being paid to survey this territory, and by God, they were going to do the job properly. Looking back, this decision sealed their fate. But in the moment, with daylight making the previous night's fear seem foolish, Antoine's logic appeared sound. Mercier and Claude reluctantly agreed to continue, though Claude insisted they maintain a constant watch and never camp in the same location 2 nights in a row. For 3 days, they pushed deeper into the territory, trying to focus on their surveying work. The landscape grew increasingly wild and desolate. Massive old-growth pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most sunlight, even at midday. Between the ancient trees, the forest floor lay buried under snow that had accumulated for months without melting. No trails existed here. The 3 men were likely the first Europeans to see this particular stretch of wilderness. They found evidence of old hunting camps, some appearing to be decades or even centuries old, built by indigenous peoples and long abandoned. At one site, Claude discovered something that made him insist they turn back. Hanging from a tall pine were bundles wrapped in birch bark and suspended from leather cords, clearly intentional placements by human hands. Claude recognized them as Ojibwe warning markers, the kind placed to indicate areas of spiritual danger. He couldn't read the symbols marked on the bark, but the fact that they existed at all in such a remote location suggested this forest had a reputation stretching back generations. That night, January 13th, they made camp in a small ravine that offered some protection from the wind. The temperature had dropped dramatically, perhaps reaching 30 or 40 below zero. Setting up their shelter in such cold was brutal work. Fingers went numb in seconds. Breath froze into ice crystals that clung to beards and eyebrows. But they managed to get a good fire going and huddled close to its warmth. They'd shot nothing that day, despite seeing old game trails. The forest seemed abandoned by all living things. Even the usual winter birds were absent. Brutus remained agitated, refusing to eat, constantly staring into the darkness beyond their firelight. Around midnight, the dog suddenly stood, every muscle in its body rigid, and released a long, mournful howl that echoed through the frozen forest. Before any of the men could react, Brutus bolted into the darkness and disappeared. They called for the dog for hours but got no response. Finally, exhausted and freezing, they gave up and returned to the fire. Sleep came fitfully. Mercier's journal records that he woke several times during the night to sounds he couldn't identify. Branches snapping in the distance, a sound like labored breathing, raspy and wet, coming from somewhere just beyond the firelight. And once, distinctly, a sound like laughter, high-pitched and inhuman, that might have been a bird except that it went on too long and seemed to come from something with lungs far larger than any bird possessed. Each time Mercier Mercier woke, he found at least one of his companions already awake, rifle in hand, staring into the darkness with wide, frightened eyes. Dawn revealed their worst fears. The snow around their camp was covered in tracks, the same elongated, barefooted prints they'd seen before, but this time showing that whatever made them had circled their shelter dozens of times throughout the night, coming progressively closer with each circuit. Some tracks came within 3 feet of where they'd been sleeping. They found scraps of fur and frozen blood about 30 yards from camp. The remains were clearly from Brutus, but there wasn't enough left to bury. Whatever killed the dog had consumed most of it, leaving only the parts that contained no meat. The skull stripped completely clean, some of the leg bones cracked open to extract the marrow, and disturbingly, the paws arranged in a neat row, as if displayed deliberately. Antoine had finally had enough. His bravado was gone, replaced by barely concealed terror. All 3 men agreed they needed to leave immediately. They abandoned most of their gear, keeping only their rifles, a minimal amount of supplies, and their snowshoes. The plan was to travel as fast as possible back to Moose Factory, covering in 2 days what had taken them a week to traverse coming in. They set out at first light, moving in single file with Claude in the lead, Mercier in the middle, and Antoine bringing up the rear. For the first few hours, they made excellent time, following their old trail back through the forest. The weather held clear and cold. They saw no signs of pursuit. It seemed like they might actually make it out. Then, around 2 in the afternoon, as they stopped briefly to rest and drink water, Antoine noticed something that made him go pale. Their trail, the tracks they'd made days earlier when traveling into the wilderness, had been followed by the elongated, barefoot prints. Whatever was stalking them had been tracing their route, studying their movements, perhaps even anticipating where they'd go. And based on the freshness of these new tracks, it had passed by this spot within the last hour, which meant it was somewhere ahead of them now. Waiting. They had a choice. Try to forge a new route through trackless wilderness in deep snow, which would be exhausting and risk getting lost, or continue following their established trail, knowing something was lying in ambush somewhere ahead. They chose to continue forward, but with weapons ready and maximum alertness. Claude moved carefully, studying every shadow, every possible hiding place. They spread out to avoid presenting a clustered target. Their progress slowed to a crawl as they advanced through increasingly difficult terrain. The forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The temperature dropped further as what little warmth the sun provided was cut off. And then Claude stopped so suddenly that Mercier nearly walked into him. Ahead, hanging from a low branch directly over their trail, was a human hand. The hand had been severed cleanly at the wrist and suspended by a leather cord wrapped around the thumb. It was frozen solid, flesh pale, and waxy. But the truly horrifying detail was that the hand was fresh, killed within the last day or 2, and it wore a ring that Antoine immediately recognized. It belonged to a trapper named Louis Desalines, who'd left Moose Factory 3 months earlier to check trap lines in this very region. Louis had never returned, and a search party had failed to find any trace of him. Now they knew why. The hand hanging before them was both a warning and a promise. This was a trap line of a very different sort, and they were the prey being harvested. Something moved in the trees above them. All 3 men fired simultaneously, their rifles creating a deafening roar that echoed through the forest. Branches exploded in showers of bark and pine needles. They reloaded frantically and fired again, aiming at shadows and movement, not certain what they were shooting at, but desperate to drive it away. When the echoes finally faded and the gun smoke cleared, they saw nothing. No body falling from the trees, no blood in the snow, just disturbed branches and the settling debris from their shots. But they also heard something new, a sound like breathing, heavy and labored, coming from multiple directions at once as if they were surrounded. And underneath the breathing, a low vocalization that might have been words in some guttural, corrupted language, or might have been nothing more than an animal's growl, shaped by a throat that remembered human speech. They ran, abandoned all pretense of caution, and simply ran, crashing through the forest at a reckless pace that risked injury with every step. Deep snow grabbed at their snowshoes. Low branches struck them in the face and chest. The cold air seared their lungs as they gasped for breath. Behind them, they could hear pursuit. Not the sound of footsteps exactly, but something moving through the branches above them, leaping from tree to tree with impossible agility, keeping pace easily despite their panicked flight. Occasionally, they'd glimpse something in their peripheral vision, a pale, elongated figure that seemed far too tall and far too thin to be human. Eyes that reflected their lantern light like an animal's, but positioned too high off the ground. The sense of something that had once been a man but had been stretched and distorted into a new shape. A shape built for hunting in the winter darkness. Claude went down first. One moment he was ahead of them, breaking trail through the snow. The next moment, he'd simply vanished. Mercier and Antoine skidded to a stop, looking back to see a hole in the snow where Claude had been. Not a natural depression, but a pit that had been deliberately dug and carefully concealed under a thin layer of snow and branches. A trap. They approached cautiously, calling Claude's name, and found him at the bottom of the 8-foot pit, his left leg bent at an impossible angle, bone protruding through torn pants and flesh. He was conscious but in shock, breath coming in short gasps, face white as the snow around him. There was no way he could climb out, no way he could walk, and they all knew what it meant. They'd have to leave him or all die trying to save him. The decision was taken from them. From somewhere close by came a sound like a scream mixed with laughter. Triumphant and terrible, the thing that had been stalking them was announcing its victory, declaring the hunt successful. Antoine made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He looked at Claude lying broken at the bottom of the pit, then looked at Mercier, and without a word, they both turned and ran. They left their companion behind, abandoning him to whatever fate the forest had prepared. Behind them, Claude's scream started almost immediately, cut off suddenly after only a few seconds, in a way that suggested his throat had been torn out, rather than him simply dying. The abrupt silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Mercier and Antoine ran through the night, no longer following any trail, simply trying to put distance between themselves and the horror behind them. They became lost almost immediately, but didn't care. Lost meant away from the pit, away from whatever had taken Claude, away from the hunting ground they'd stumbled into. Somewhere around midnight, they collapsed from exhaustion in a cluster of fallen trees. They managed to start a small fire, more for psychological comfort than warmth. Neither man spoke. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, rifles across their laps, waiting for dawn and trying not to think about the sounds they could hear in the forest around them. Movement, breathing, the snap of breaking branches. The thing was still out there, still hunting, still hungry. As false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Antoine broke the silence with words Mercier would never forget. He said that during the night, while Mercier had been half asleep on his side of the fire. Antoine had seen it clearly for the first time. It had stood at the edge of the firelight for nearly a minute, studying them, and Antoine had been too paralyzed with fear to even raise his rifle. He described a figure easily 8 feet tall, gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, its skin pale as snow and pulled tight over bones that seemed too large for a human frame. Its face was the worst part, still recognizably human in structure but elongated, the jaw distended as if unhinged, the teeth visible through lips that had pulled back or rotted away. Its eyes were the clouded white of snow, blindness. But they'd focused on Antoine with clear intelligence and terrible hunger, and its hands, elongated fingers ending in what looked like black fingernails, but were actually frostbite necrosis, opened and closed rhythmically, as if already imagining tearing into flesh. But here's what made Antoine's voice shake as he described it. He recognized the thing. Beneath the transformation, beneath the corruption and the horrible changes, he could still see traces of human features, and those features belonged to Louis Dessalines, the trapper whose severed hand they'd found hanging on the trail. Louis hadn't simply been killed by the Wendigo. He'd become one. The combination of isolation, starvation, and whatever had driven him to consume human flesh to survive had transformed him into the very thing that now hunted them. And if the legends were true, if the curse was real, then Claude was about to join him. Anyone consumed by a Wendigo, anyone who died in its hunting ground, risked becoming one themselves. The forest would soon have two of these creatures stalking its depths instead of one. They waited until full daylight, then continued their desperate flight. Without Claude to lead them, without any clear sense of direction, they simply moved in what they hoped was a northward direction toward James Bay and safety. The sun rose but provided little warmth. The temperature remained brutally cold. They'd lost most of their supplies in their panicked flight, and hunger began to gnaw at them alongside the exhaustion. By midday, they were stumbling more than walking, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. That's when Mercier noticed Antoine had fallen behind. He turned to find his companion stopped in the middle of the trail, staring at something in his hand. It was a piece of dried meat, pulled from Antoine's pocket. Salt pork from their original supplies, the same supplies that had been stolen days earlier, which meant this meat had been in the Wendigo's possession before somehow finding its way into Antoine's pocket. Mercier watched in horror as Antoine slowly raised the meat to his mouth. In his journal, Mercier would later try to explain what happened next. He wrote that Antoine's face had changed, that his eyes had taken on the same clouded, hungry look that he'd described seeing in the Wendigo the night before, that Antoine seemed to be moving in a dream, compelled by something beyond his control. Mercier shouted at him to stop, even raised his rifle in threat, but Antoine's jaw was already opening, impossibly wide, and something that wasn't quite laughter was bubbling up from his throat. In that moment, Mercier realized the truth. The curse hadn't waited for death. It was claiming Antoine while he still lived, using hunger and exhaustion and the seed of cannibalistic thought planted by days of exposure to Wendigo influence. Antoine was transforming before his eyes. Mercier ran, left his last companion behind, and ran with the final reserves of his strength. He no longer cared about direction or survival. He simply needed to get away from what Antoine was becoming. Behind him, he could hear screaming, though whether it was Antoine fighting the transformation or embracing it, he never knew. Hours blurred together. The forest became a nightmare of white and shadow, trees that all looked the same, snow that seemed to go on forever. Several times, Mercier felt certain he was about to die, that his strength would give out, and he'd freeze in place to become just another victim of the winter and the Wendigo. But somehow he kept moving, driven by pure terror. Mercier was found 2 days later by an Ojibwe hunting party, barely alive and completely delirious. They'd heard rifle shots in the distance and gone to investigate, finding him collapsed in the snow with severe frostbite. He was carried back to their winter camp, treated with herbal medicines, and kept warm by their fires. For 3 days, he remained in a fever, speaking in French too rapid for his rescuers to follow, clearly reliving whatever trauma he had experienced. When his fever finally broke, he told them everything. The Ojibwe elders listened to his account with grave faces, but without surprise. They knew this story because they'd heard versions of it before. The Wendigo was real, and it walked the winter forests, and sometimes it turned men into monsters when desperation and hunger broke them at the moment of their greatest need. They told Mercier he'd been lucky, that the spirits had guided him to safety because his heart had remained clean even when surrounded by corruption. They warned him never to return to that region of forest, that it was claimed now by the Wendigo and would remain dangerous until either the creature was destroyed or it starved and died alone in the wilderness it had made its hunting ground. Mercier eventually made it back to Moose Factory in late February, carried most of the way by his Ojibwe rescuers and trading parties that moved goods between camps. His frostbite was severe. He lost 3 toes and parts of several fingers, but he was alive. The Hudson's Bay Company officials who debriefed him were skeptical of his story, preferring to believe he and his companions had simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements through poor planning. They refused to organize a search party, deeming it too dangerous and unlikely to find anything useful given the winter conditions. Mercier was paid for his weeks of work, but quietly dismissed from company employment. His story was too disturbing, too irrational. It reflected poorly on the company's operations to have employees spreading tales of monsters in territory they were trying to develop for commercial trapping, but Mercier's account didn't disappear. He repeated it to anyone who would listen, driven by a need to warn others away from that cursed stretch of forest. His journal survived, though heavily damaged by water and weather. The portions that remained legible provided dates, locations, and details that corroborated the basic facts of the expedition, even if they couldn't prove the supernatural elements. Other trappers began sharing similar stories, encounters in the deep wilderness that didn't fit rational explanation. None of these accounts were given much credence by authorities, but among the men who actually worked in the deep forest, who understood how quickly the wilderness could kill, the stories were taken seriously. Thomas Mercier lived for another 18 years after his ordeal, dying in 1909 at the age of 53. He never trapped again, instead working various manual labor jobs in settlements along James Bay, staying close to other people and avoiding the deep forest. He married late in life and had 2 children, neither of whom he ever told about his experience in 1891. But his nightmares were legendary among those who knew him. Several times a week, he'd wake screaming, speaking in rapid French about something in the trees, about hunger that couldn't be satisfied, about the moment he'd looked into Antoine's changing face and seen humanity dying behind his eyes. His wife would find him sitting by the window in the coldest part of winter, staring out into the darkness, rifle across his lap, watching for something that might still be coming for him. The thing about Wendigo stories that makes them different from most cryptid or monster accounts is the psychological element at their core. This isn't a creature that simply hunts for food or defends its territory. It's a manifestation of human corruption, a physical representation of what happens when survival instinct pushes people past the final moral boundary. The indigenous peoples who originated these stories weren't describing an external threat, like a bear or wolf. They were describing an internal one. The knowledge that under the right conditions, any person could be transformed into something monstrous. The Ojibwe elders who helped save Mercier told him something he included in his journal, but never fully understood. They said the Wendigo often leaves one survivor, not out of mercy, but as part of its nature. The survivor carries the story, spreads the warning, makes others aware of the danger, but the survivor also carries the seed, the knowledge of what humans can become, the understanding that the capacity for transformation exists in everyone. This knowledge itself is a kind of infection, a way for the Wendigo to spread its influence even without physical transformation. By making people aware of the possibility, by planting fear and the idea of cannibalism in their minds, the Wendigo ensures that in future situations of desperation, that option will be remembered, will be considered. Thomas Mercier lived for another 18 years after his ordeal, dying in 1909 at the age of 53. He never trapped again, working various manual labor jobs in settlements along James Bay, staying close to other people, and avoiding the deep forest. He married late and had 2 children, neither of whom he ever told about his experience in 1891, but his nightmares were legendary among those who knew him. Several times a week, he'd wake screaming, speaking in rapid French about something in the trees, about hunger that couldn't be satisfied, about the moment he'd looked into Antoine's changing face and seen humanity dying behind his eyes. His wife would find him sitting by the window in the coldest part of winter, staring out into the darkness, rifle across his lap, watching for something that might still be coming for him. And what happened next in that forest would prove he had every reason to remain afraid. The forest that had claimed Claude Fontaine and Antoine Bouchard didn't remain quiet after Thomas Mercier's escape. Within weeks of his rescue, the Ojibwe communities around James Bay began reporting new disturbances in that cursed territory. Hunting parties returning from the edges of the Forbidden Zone spoke of hearing screams in the night, sounds that started human, but twisted into something else entirely before cutting off abruptly. Trappers found their lines destroyed, not by animals looking for easy meals, but by something that seemed to take deliberate pleasure in sabotage. Traps were smashed, bait was scattered, and in some cases, the steel jaws had been bent completely open as if by hands of immense strength. Most disturbing were the tracks found near these destroyed trap lines. The same elongated barefoot prints Mercier had described, but now appearing in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting that whatever had taken Antoine wasn't alone anymore. An Ojibwe elder named Joseph Wabanaki, who'd been among those who saved Mercier, decided something had to be done. At 73 years old, Joseph was respected throughout the region as a keeper of traditional knowledge, a man who understood both the practical and spiritual aspects of surviving in the northern wilderness. He'd seen Wendigo affliction before, decades earlier when he was a young man, and he knew that ignoring the problem wouldn't make it disappear. Wendigos didn't starve and die peacefully. They grew stronger with each victim they consumed, and they could persist for years or even decades if left unchecked. The forest where the trappers had met their fate was too close to established hunting grounds. If the creatures weren't dealt with soon, they'd expand their territory, and more people would die. Joseph gathered a party of 7 men, all experienced hunters who'd volunteered knowing the danger they faced. They weren't going to hunt the Wendigo in the traditional sense. You couldn't kill a Wendigo with bullets or blades alone because it wasn't truly alive in the way normal creatures were. It existed in a state between life and death, sustained by its terrible hunger and the curse that had transformed it. But Wendigos could be stopped through a combination of physical force and spiritual intervention. The creature had to be contained first, then destroyed completely, typically through fire. The key was coordination and absolute commitment. Half measures would only make the Wendigo more dangerous. They departed in late March of 1891, when the worst of winter had passed, but snow still covered the ground. The timing was deliberate. Spring meant longer daylight hours, crucial for the kind of work they'd be doing. It also meant the Wendigos would be weaker, as the warming temperatures diminished some of the ice that had formed in their hearts and bodies. Joseph led them along routes that avoided the most direct path, circling the cursed territory and approaching from the west rather than the north, as Mercier's party had done. They made offerings at traditional sites along the way, leaving tobacco and asking the spirits for protection and guidance. These weren't empty rituals to the men performing them. They were necessary preparations for entering a place where the normal rules of the world had been suspended. On the 5th day of their journey, they found the first body, or rather, what remained of one. Scattered across a small clearing were bones that had been cracked open and gnawed, scraps of frozen flesh and torn clothing, and a skull that Joseph immediately recognized. The dental work, a distinctive gold filling in one of the molars, matched descriptions of Louis Dessalines, the trapper who disappeared months before Mercier's expedition. But the condition of the remains told a story more disturbing than simple death. The bones showed evidence of having been consumed over an extended period. Some were weathered and old, while others still had frozen tissue attached. The Wendigo, that had been Louis, hadn't died after killing Claude and pursuing Mercier. It had returned to this site repeatedly, feeding on its own previous remains, caught in a cycle of self-consumption that defied logic and nature. Joseph ordered the bones gathered and burned immediately. Fire was crucial. Any remains left intact could serve as an anchor point for Wendigo spirits, a place they'd return to again and again. As the flames consumed Louis's bones, several of the hunters reported hearing sounds in the distance, not animal calls, but something that might have been words. Syllables drawn out and distorted until they became meaningless howls. The Wendigos knew they were there. The hunt had begun, but it wasn't clear who would be the hunters and who would be the prey. They found Claude Fontaine's body the next day, still at the bottom of the pit where he'd fallen. The condition of the remains was exactly as Mercier had described in his account. The body had been fed upon extensively, bones broken to extract marrow, the skull opened. But what Joseph found most telling was the arrangement of the remains. The bones had been carefully organized, almost reverently, suggesting that whoever or whatever had consumed Claude had maintained enough human consciousness to feel some vestige of respect, or perhaps remorse. This gave Joseph hope. If Claude hadn't fully transformed before dying, if his consumption by the Wendigo had been an act of hunger rather than a willing embrace of the curse, then perhaps his spirit wasn't trapped in this place. Perhaps only 2 Wendigos stalked this forest rather than 3. They burned Claude's remains as well, conducting the ceremony with proper respect and asking the spirits to guide him to the afterlife he deserved. As darkness fell, they made camp in a defensible position on high ground with good sight lines in all directions. The fire was built large and hot. Everyone remained awake, weapons ready, watching the tree line. Joseph had explained what they should expect. The Wendigos would come. They'd circle the camp, testing for weakness, trying to identify the easiest target. They'd attempt to use psychological warfare, calling out in voices that sounded like loved ones, making sounds designed to provoke investigation. The key was to remain together, to not let fear or curiosity separate anyone from the group. Around midnight, the sound started. Footsteps in the snow, heavy and deliberate, circling their position. At first, just one set, then another joining from a different direction. The 2 Wendigos were coordinating, working together in a way that suggested disturbing intelligence. One of the younger hunters, a man named Pierre Leclerc, suddenly stiffened and raised his rifle. He claimed he could hear his wife calling for help from the darkness, her voice terrified and pleading. Joseph grabbed Pierre's arm before he could move, speaking firmly in Ojibwe, reminding him that his wife was safe at home 3 days' travel away, that what he heard was a trick designed to separate him from the group. Pierre nodded, but kept his rifle aimed at the darkness, his hands shaking. Then they saw them, 2 figures at the edge of the firelight, barely visible but unmistakably present. The first, was incredibly tall, perhaps 8 feet or more, gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, its skin pale as snow and stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for any human frame. Its face was elongated, jaw distended, eyes clouded white, but clearly focused on the men around the fire. This was what Antoine Bouchard had become. Months of existence as a Wendigo had completed his transformation, leaving nothing recognizably human except the general shape. The second figure was slightly shorter, but no less disturbing. This was Louis Dessalines, or what he'd become, and his transformation appeared even more advanced. His skin had taken on a grayish tone. Ice crystals visibly formed on his exposed flesh, and when his mouth opened, it revealed teeth that had grown longer and sharper, adapted for tearing meat from bone. Joseph stood slowly, speaking in Ojibwe in a voice that carried authority across the clearing. He told the Wendigos that their time in this world was finished, that they'd caused enough suffering, that the spirits had decreed their end. The creatures didn't retreat, but they didn't immediately attack either. Instead, something remarkable happened. The one that had been Antoine tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost human, almost questioning. And then it spoke. The voice was wrong, like gravel being ground together, words formed by a throat not designed for human speech. But the words were French. It said a name. Marie. Antoine's wife. It said the name again, with what might have been longing or might have been hunger. Joseph realized with horror that some fragment of Antoine's consciousness still existed inside the monster, trapped and aware of what it had become. This changed the situation. Joseph had assumed he was dealing with fully transformed Wendigos, creatures that had completely lost their humanity and existed only to feed. But if Antoine retained some awareness, some memory of his previous life, then there might be another way. He spoke to the creature in French, addressing it by its human name, asking if Antoine could still understand him. The Wendigo that had been Antoine took a step closer, and several of the hunters raised their rifles in response. But Joseph gestured for them to hold fire. He asked Antoine if he wanted to be free, if he wanted the hunger to end, if he wanted peace. The creature's response was a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a growl. It raised one elongated hand and pointed at its own chest, then made a striking motion as if plunging a blade into its heart. Joseph understood. Some part of Antoine was still fighting the Wendigo curse, still aware enough to want death, to beg for release from the monster he'd become. But here was the tragedy that made Wendigo affliction so cruel. The human consciousness trapped inside couldn't control the body anymore. The hunger, the curse, the transformation had taken over completely. Antoine could watch through his own eyes as his body hunted and killed and fed, but he couldn't stop it. He'd been a passenger in his own flesh for months, experiencing every horrific act while being powerless to prevent any of it. The only mercy anyone could offer him now was destruction. The second Wendigo, the one that had been Louis, suddenly charged. It moved with impossible speed, covering 50 feet in seconds, heading straight for the youngest member of Joseph's party. But Joseph had anticipated this. He'd positioned his most experienced hunters, watching Louis while he engaged with Antoine, knowing that Louis had been a Wendigo longer and would be more aggressive, less connected to his human past. 3 rifles fired simultaneously. The bullet struck Louis' center mass, and while they didn't kill the creature, they staggered it long enough for the hunters to grab their prepared weapons. Long spears with iron points that had been blessed in traditional ceremonies and wrapped with tobacco and sage. What followed was brutal and chaotic. Louis thrashed and fought with strength that seemed impossible for something so emaciated. 2 hunters were knocked aside, one suffering broken ribs from a glancing blow. But the hunting party had numbers and preparation on their side. They drove Louis back toward a pre-dug pit they'd concealed near their camp, a trap within a trap. When the creature fell into the hole, they didn't hesitate. Wood soaked in pitch was thrown down on top of it, followed by burning branches from their fire. Louis's screams, as the flames took hold, were terrible to hear, starting deep and guttural, before rising to a pitch that seemed impossible for any living thing to produce. The screams went on for nearly 10 minutes before finally cutting off, and even after the sound stopped, the hunters continued feeding the fire until nothing remained but ash and charred bone fragments. Antoine watched all of this without moving. When it was over, when Louis had been reduced to ashes, Antoine looked at Joseph and slowly, deliberately, walked into the still burning pit. The hunters started forward to stop him, but Joseph raised his hand. He understood what was happening. This was Antoine's choice, the only act of will he'd been able to muster since his transformation. He was choosing to end it, to burn himself out rather than continue existing as a monster. As the flames engulfed him, the Wendigo's body began to change. For just a moment, in the flickering firelight, the hunters saw Antoine as he'd been before the curse. A normal man, not a monster, his face showing relief rather than agony. Then the flames intensified, and there was nothing left but fire and smoke, and the gradual certainty that it was finally over. Joseph's hunting party remained at the site for 3 more days, making absolutely certain both Wendigos had been destroyed completely. They burned the pit until the ground itself was scorched black. They burned the trees where the creatures had sheltered. They found and burned every campsite, every bone cache, every trace that the Wendigos had left behind. The spiritual cleansing rituals were extensive and exhausting, designed to purge the land of the corruption that had taken root there. On the 4th day, Joseph declared the forest clean. The Wendigo curse had been broken. The territory was safe again for human use. When they returned to the settlements around James Bay, Joseph went directly to find Thomas Mercier. He found the former trapper working at the trading post, still gaunt and haunted, despite the months that had passed since his ordeal. Joseph told him everything that had happened, how Antoine had retained some fragment of awareness, how he'd chosen to end his existence in the flames, how both Wendigos had been destroyed and the forest cleansed. Mercier listened in silence, and when Joseph finished, the Frenchman began to weep. They were complicated tears, mixing relief with guilt and grief. Relief that the nightmare was truly over. Guilt that he'd survived while his companions hadn't. Grief for the men they'd been before the forest changed them. Joseph told Mercier something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He said that Antoine's moment of choice at the end, his decision to walk into the flames, had redeemed him spiritually. The curse had claimed his body but not his soul. By choosing death over continuing as a monster, Antoine had broken the Wendigo's hold in the only way possible. He died as a man, not as a creature. This meant his spirit could move on rather than being trapped forever in the cursed forest. It was small comfort, but it was something. Mercier thanked Joseph and asked if the elder would teach him the proper prayers for the dead, the Ojibwe ceremonies that would honor Antoine and Claude appropriately. Joseph agreed, and over the following weeks, the two men spent many hours together, Mercier learning traditions that might help him make peace with what had happened. The story of the Wendigo hunt spread through the region, though, like Mercier's original account, it was met with skepticism by European authorities and traders. The Hudson's Bay Company's official records make no mention of Joseph Wabanaki's expedition or its purpose, but among the indigenous communities and the French-Canadian trappers who worked closely with them, the account was accepted as truth. The forbidden territory was gradually reopened for trapping, though for several years trappers approached it cautiously and never stayed after dark. Over time, as seasons passed without incident, the forest returned to normal use. Game returned. Trap lines proved productive. The darkness that had claimed the land seemed to have lifted completely, but there were occasional reminders that something terrible had happened there. Trees bore scorch marks that never fully faded. The pit where the Wendigos had burned remained barren, nothing growing in that scorched earth even decades later. Hunters sometimes found bones that Joseph's party had missed, fragments scattered deep in the wilderness, and they always burned them immediately without investigating too closely. And Mercier himself, until his death in 1909, refused to ever set foot in that region again. Despite the opportunities for profitable trapping, he'd carry the memory of what happened there until his last breath. In the years following the Wendigo hunt, researchers began paying more attention to indigenous accounts of Wendigo affliction. The case of the 1891 trappers was relatively well documented, with Mercier's journal, Joseph's testimony, and corroborating accounts from multiple sources. While skeptics explained it as hysteria or cultural psychosis, others noted that too many details matched across independent reports. The case of the 1891 trappers remained a subject of study for decades. In 1967, an anthropology student from McGill University conducted fieldwork in communities around James Bay and collected oral histories related to the incident. He found that the story had become part of local tradition, passed down through generations with remarkable consistency. Elderly informants whose grandparents had known Mercier repeated details that matched his journal entries, despite the informants never having read those journals. The student noted that in indigenous tellings of the story, certain elements were emphasized that Mercier hadn't included in his written account, particularly the moment when Antoine chose to walk into the flames. This detail had become central to how the Ojibwe community understood the incident, treating it as a teaching story about redemption and the power of human will to overcome even the worst corruption. By the time the 21st century arrived, the forest where the trappers had their encounter had been thoroughly mapped and incorporated into modern recreation areas. Hiking trails passed through territory that had once been considered cursed. The pit where the Wendigos burned had been discovered by researchers who confirmed through carbon dating that a large fire had occurred there in approximately 1891, with ash layers containing what appeared to be bone fragments. No attempt was made to analyze the fragments more closely. Some mysteries, the researchers felt, were better left unexamined. The area was marked on newer maps simply as historic indigenous cultural site and left undisturbed. Thomas Mercier's great-grandson, a man named Robert Mercier, still lived in Ontario as of 2015 and maintained a small archive of family documents. Among them was his great-grandfather's journal, carefully preserved despite water damage and age. Robert had made his own pilgrimage to the forest where the events occurred, wanting to connect with that piece of family history. He reported that standing in those woods, particularly in winter, gave him a profound sense of unease. Nothing he could point to specifically, no threats or strange occurrences, just an overwhelming feeling that he was trespassing in a place that remembered suffering. He spent 3 days camping in the area, and each night he had vivid dreams of being pursued through snow-covered trees. The dreams stopped as soon as he left the forest and never recurred. Robert chose not to return. The question of what really happened in that forest in 1891 continues to generate debate. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence beyond charred bones and scorched earth, neither of which prove anything supernatural occurred. They argue that Mercier and his companions got lost, suffered exposure and starvation, and that the psychological trauma combined with cultural beliefs about Wendigos created a shared delusion. They note that human beings under extreme stress are capable of incredible feats of strength and endurance that can seem impossible under normal circumstances. A starving, hypothermic person experiencing psychotic breaks might indeed appear monstrous to witnesses, but others argue that the skeptical explanation requires dismissing too much corroborated testimony from multiple independent sources. Joseph Wabanaki and his hunting party weren't suffering from starvation or exposure. They went into the forest prepared and with clear minds, yet they reported seeing the same physical characteristics Mercier described. They engaged in direct combat with the creatures and reported superhuman strength and speed. Pierre Leclerc was a level-headed hunter with decades of wilderness experience. Are we to believe he was hallucinating or lying when he described the encounter in detail to Dr. Sinclair? And if it was all cultural delusion, why did the burning work? Why did the incident stop completely after Joseph's expedition? If the Wendigos were figments of imagination, what were the hunters actually fighting and burning in that forest? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between supernatural horror and psychological crisis. Perhaps what happened to Antoine Bouchard and Louis Dessalines was a combination of both physical and spiritual elements, an extreme stress response that manifested in ways we still don't fully understand, amplified and shaped by cultural beliefs that gave form to their transformation. Perhaps the Wendigo isn't a single explainable phenomenon, but rather a name given to the darkest potential of human survival instinct, the moment when civilization falls away and we become willing to do anything to continue existing. The transformation described in the stories might be partially literal, as the body and mind adapt to extreme conditions in disturbing ways, and partially symbolic, representing the death of the person someone was and the birth of the monster they became. What remains undeniable is that something happened in that Ontario forest in the winter of 1891 that traumatized everyone who encountered it. 3 men entered the wilderness as experienced trappers and friends. Only one emerged, physically broken and psychologically scarred for life. 2 died in ways that multiple witnesses described as abnormal and horrific. And the indigenous community that had lived with the knowledge of Wendigo affliction for generations recognized the pattern immediately and knew exactly what needed to be done to end it. Whether we call it curse, psychosis, transformation, or something else entirely, the Wendigo phenomenon was real enough to the people who experienced it directly. Thomas Mercier spent the last years of his life trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. His journals, beyond the official expedition log, contain pages of speculation and soul-searching. He wrote about guilt, about whether there was anything he could have done differently to save his companions. He wrote about the moment he saw Antoine's face begin to change, trying to understand what exactly he'd witnessed in that transformation. He wrote about dreams where he was back in the forest, back at the moment when Claude fell into the pit, but in the dreams he made different choices. He stayed. He fought. He died alongside his friends rather than running. These dreams bothered him more than the nightmares because they revealed his deepest shame. Not that he'd survived, but that part of him felt he should have died instead. In his final entry, written just weeks before his death from pneumonia in 1909, Mercier reflected on a visit he'd received from Joseph Wabanaki, the old Ojibwe elder, then well into his 90s, had made the journey to see Mercier one last time. They'd sat together by Mercier's fire, 2 old men who'd witnessed something that had changed them both. Joseph told Mercier that he'd performed ceremonies to ensure that Antoine and Claude's spirits had found peace and that the spirits had responded favorably. The souls of Mercier's companions were free, no longer trapped by what had happened. Joseph said Mercier should free himself as well, should stop carrying guilt for surviving, should understand that he'd been spared for a reason. His survival allowed the story to be told. His testimony allowed Joseph to know what needed to be done. Without Mercier's account, more people would have died before the Wendigos were stopped. Mercier wrote that Joseph's words had finally granted him something he'd sought for 18 years. Not exactly peace, but acceptance. He could accept that he had survived. He could accept that his companions had died. He could accept that the forest had shown him something terrible about the nature of human beings, about how thin the line is between civilization and savagery, between person and monster. He wrote that he no longer feared death, that when it came, he would face it calmly, knowing he'd done what he could with the life he'd been given. He ended the entry with a prayer, half in French and half in Ojibwe, asking whatever spirits listened to watch over the forest and prevent another Wendigo from ever rising there again. The prayer appears to have been answered. In the more than century since Joseph Wabanaki's hunting party cleansed that territory, there have been no confirmed reports of Wendigo activity in that specific region. Oh, there have been occasional stories from other parts of the north, other isolated incidents in other forests where extreme conditions and desperation might have created similar circumstances. The Wendigo phenomenon, whatever its true nature, didn't end completely, but that particular forest, that hunting ground where Louis and Antoine had stalked and killed, remained clean. Game returned. Trees grew where fire had once burned. Life continued. The curse, if it was a curse, had been broken permanently. Today, if you visit the region around James Bay, you can still find people who know the story of the 1891 trappers. It's part of local history, taught to children as both warning and lesson. Warning about the dangers of hubris, of going into the wilderness, unprepared, not just physically, but spiritually. Warning about what isolation and desperation can do to the human mind and soul, and lesson about redemption, about the fact that even someone who'd become a monster could, in their final moment, reclaim their humanity through an act of will. Antoine Bouchard's choice to walk into the flames is remembered not as the death of a Wendigo, but as the sacrifice of a man who refused to let the curse claim his soul even after it had claimed his body. The forest where it all happened is quiet now. Pine trees grow tall and thick. Snow falls each winter as it always has. Wolves howl in the distance. Owls hunt in the darkness. Everything is as it should be. The boundaries between life and death, between human and monster, between the natural and supernatural, are no longer blurred in that place. The Wendigo has passed into story and memory, but the story remains powerful because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. It reminds us that we're capable of becoming monsters if we abandon our humanity. And it offers hope that even when we fall, even when we transform into something terrible, there might still be a path back, a choice we can make, a moment of redemption that allows us to die as ourselves rather than as the worst thing we could become. Thomas Mercier understood this in the end. That's why he stopped fearing the Wendigo that might still be coming for him. That's why he put down the rifle and stopped watching the darkness. He realized the real danger wasn't something lurking in the forest waiting to claim him. The real danger had always been internal. The capacity for corruption existed inside everyone. And the only defense was remaining connected to your humanity, to your community, to the values that define you as a person, rather than as a creature driven only by survival. As long as he held on to that, as long as he remained Thomas Mercier rather than becoming something else, the Wendigo couldn't touch him. And so the story ends not with horror, but with understanding. The forest is just a forest. The winter is just winter. The hunger is just hunger. These things are dangerous only if we let them transform us, only if we cross the lines that should never be crossed in pursuit of survival. The trappers who entered the wilderness in 1891 learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. Two paid with their lives and their humanity. One paid with psychological trauma that lasted decades. But the knowledge gained, the understanding of how close we all are to becoming monsters and how important it is to resist that transformation. That knowledge was worth the price paid. It had to be, because the alternative was to believe their suffering had no meaning at all. The Wendigo walks through indigenous traditions and Canadian folklore as both monster and metaphor. It exists in the space between the real and the symbolic, in the cold, dark places where human beings face their ultimate nature. The 1891 trappers met it and were changed forever. But through their story, Through Mercier's testimony and Joseph's actions and Antoine's final choice, they left us something valuable, a reminder that monsters are real, not in the sense of supernatural entities that violate natural law, but in the sense that human beings, under the right terrible conditions, can become monstrous, and a reminder that we have the power to resist, to choose humanity over survival, to die as ourselves rather than live as demons. That's the real ending of the Wendigo story, not the monsters being burned, but the understanding that we contain both the capacity for becoming monsters and the strength to refuse that transformation, no matter what the winter brings.